Okay, thank you so much, everyone, for joining us. My name is Chip Gibbons. I use he, him, his pronouns. I'm with the Metro DC chapter of the Democratic Socialist of America. As you have heard, we're going to have interpretation this evening. This session will be presented in both English and Spanish. I believe this is our first time using interpretation, so if it's a little bit slow to get started, I apologize. We're really excited for tonight's session. I want to thank both the internationalism working group of the DC chapter of Metro DC chapter of Democratic Socialists of America, as well as the DC chapter of the Puerto Rican Independence Party. We are super honored that they're both joining us tonight for this really important event on Puerto Rico's fight against colonialism. So this session will be led by Dr. Rivera López. Dr. Rivera López was born, lived, and worked in Puerto Rico, and has dedicated his life to the interrelated causes of labor activism and education, the struggle for the independence of Puerto Rico, and cooperativism. He has been a teacher, union leader, and a leader in, and I'm going to apologize for my terrible Spanish pronunciation in advance, the Partido Independentista Puertorriqueño. He is a firm defender of the Democratic Socialism as an ideology and an avowed believer and leader in cooperativism. After retiring in 2019, Dr. Rivera López relocated to Maryland to work as a Spanish teacher in the AACPS district and became involved in the PIP diaspora. Now he presides the PIP-DC Committee and continues his political activism in this new session. And after he speaks, there will be question and answers, and then David will give some announcements about how to get involved with DSA and the night school. And I'm going to turn the floor over to Dr. Rivera López now.
Again, I appreciate the opportunity for sharing the situation of Puerto Rico and furthering information about Puerto Rico's fight against colonialism and for independence. I shall begin by expressing my gratitude in the name of the Partido Independentista Puertorriqueño NDC and Puerto Rico for the opportunity given by the Metro DC Socialist Night School to communicate and educate about Puerto Rico's fight for independence and against colonialism. I must begin by clarifying that I'm not a historian or a lawyer, so my presentation will not claim to be academically rigorous on either discipline. My prism is more that of a witness and a participant in the struggle for Puerto Rico's independence. Since I cast my first vote in 1980, I can call my honor of having been part of that struggle. As a member of the movement, I have been exposed to its history by learning frequently from the protagonists themselves or by the study of its texts. Those are the individual and collective recollections I'm about to deliver a glimpse into. Puerto Rico really began its fight against colonialism and for independence with what is known as El Grito de Lares, led by Dr. Ramón Emeterio Betances and Segundo Ruiz Belvis. The Grito de Lares was a well-organized attempt to establish an independent republic carried out on September 23rd, 1868. It was the crystallization of the robust independence movement that existed in Puerto Rico and that had strong ties to other independence movements in the Caribbean. Ultimately, it became, for generations to come, an inspiration and a symbol of the undying aspirations for our freedom from colonialism. This date is when the aspiration for free and independent Puerto Rico is celebrated. And we all gather in the town of Lares, which is a town located at the center west side of the island. So Lares is really where it all began. And that banner that you see there, which is different from the Puerto Rico flag, it was the Bandera de Lares, or the original flag. So we independentistas have both flags as our symbol. In 1897, Puerto Rico and Spain signed an autonomic charter, or Carta Autonómica, that gave the island a modest measure of self-government. It was a consequence of the forceful push by proponents of autonomy and independence who had gained political prominence in the declining empire's court. Shortly thereafter, when Spain was forced to relinquish sovereignty of the island, independence activists like José de Diego and Eugenio María de Hostos, among others, saw with certain degree of hope the transfer of sovereignty to the US, believing that the lofty ideals of freedom and independence espoused by intellectuals in the US will lead Puerto Rico to the independence it craved. That hope would soon be dashed. On April 12, 1898, the US Marines bombed San Juan, killing more than 100 people, women and children included. The blatantly colonialist intent of the US invasion and occupation was made clear. From the beginning, the legality of the invasion in 1898 and the Treaty of Paris that legitimized it was challenged based on the self-government provisions of the recently approved Carta Autonómica. Also, the Liga de Patriotas, a body created to further the interests of Puerto Rico, made up of a coalition of representatives of the three traditional status preferences, autonomy, statehood, and independence, objected to the invasion, claiming it was contrary to US legal tradition. Forced annexation is a criminal aggression, they claimed, because at the time, it was believed that the US would immediately grant statehood status to Puerto Rico. In 1900, due in part to local unrest with Puerto Rico's undetermined political status, Congress approves the Foraker Act, a clearly colonial government structure. It established three branches of government under the control of the US president, who named most officials along with Congress, with both Congress and the executive body retaining veto power over any locally approved regulation or legislation. Only a House of Representatives were elected to two-year terms. And famously, this law devastated the robust local economy by devaluing the local currency by 60%. I'm from a small town in Puerto Rico on the west side of the island called Maricao. By the way, it's the smallest municipality in the island. When the Americans invaded in 1898, the population of the town of Maricao was 14,000 people. Today, it's 4,500 people. When Americans invaded, coffee was the industry of choice. The coffee that was produced in my town of Puerto Rico was the coffee that the Pope drank. It was called the Black Gold. And the economy, although it was, of course, also colonial, and criollos, which were the white descendants from Spaniards, owned really capital, but really the economy was booming because of coffee, which was the same worth as gold at that time. So by devaluing the currency, all that wealth was wiped out from one day to the other. In 1917, the Jones Act gave Puerto Rico a statutory citizenship and made Puerto Rico a US territory. It also gave the island's government a semblance of legitimacy by dividing it into three branches, but it retained its clearly colonial character by giving the US executive and legislative branch veto power to override any any Puerto Rico legislation. It led to massive migration in times of the economic defenestration brought by the Foraker Act and other factors. Also, the Selective Service Act approved the same year forced 20,000 men into the military. In 1920, Don Pedro Albizu Campos, the nationalist leader, unsuccessfully challenged in court the Paris Treaty. And in 1921, Rosendo Matienzo Cintrón and Eugenio Benítez Castaño founded the Partido de la Independencia, a more inclusive party that also fought for independence. The Partido Unión was founded by the patriot from Aguadilla, José de Diego, who immediately asked for a plebiscite to determine Puerto Rico's status in the face of the reapproval of the Jones Act and its blatantly colonial nature. In 1922, the Partido Nacionalista was founded. Initially, the party was as moderate as the rest of the political spectrum in times when the desire for independence was a majority in the island, and several parties were vying for the control of the movement. That came to change when in 1932, Don Pedro Albizu Campos, a rising leader who believed, sorry, I went back. Again, that came to change in 1932, when Don Pedro Albizu Campos, a rising leader who believed in a more aggressive stance in the fight for independence and who was a Harvard-educated lawyer, engineer, and ex-lieutenant in the US Army, became its president after being its vice president since 1924. The decade of 1930 was a decade marked by political and social turmoil and strife in Puerto Rico, due mainly to the brutal economic conditions imposed by the colonial regime. In 1934, the entire island went on an agricultural strike led by Albizu. At those times, Puerto Rico was little more than an island sweatshop. Workers made 4 cents per hour and they worked 12 hours a day. Albizu shifted the party's moderate stance into an aggressive call for militants and did not shy away from the use of force, if necessary, to defend against the cruel repression of the insular police, or Policía Insular, a militarized police force, led by the US appointed governor and avowed white supremacist, Blanton Winship, who was sent to the island to solve the Puerto Rican problem by FDR and to wage war to death against all Puerto Ricans if necessary. So Blanton Winship trained the Policía Insular in the use of Tommy guns. In 1935, Winship surrounded the University of Puerto Rico to ensure peace and ended assassinating 3 nationalists and a civilian in what became known as La Masacre de Rio Piedras, and became the catalyst for a series of strikes and counter-strikes between the US occupation forces and the nationalists. Shortly after, in 1936, the nationalist leaders were sent to prison in Atlanta. On the 21st of March, 1937, Palm Sunday, the Nationalist Party organized a march to protest the jailing of its leadership in Ponce, the town of Ponce. The Policía Insular opened fire against the militants who only carried wooden props of firearms. 19 were killed and 235 wounded, including 2 policemen. After spending 10 years in prison in 1947, Albizu returned to the island and immediately began organizing an aggressive resistance to the cruel and violent repression. Governor Jesus de Piñero enacted the Ley de la Mordaza, which officially criminalized the independence movement. It carried a 10-year sentence for crimes such as speaking in public or in private, or writing in favor of independence, or even carrying a Puerto Rico flag. So Puerto Rico flags were outlawed. Scores of independence activists were jailed for these crimes. To this day, independence in Puerto Rico carries the stigma of being considered unlawful by public opinion. Eventually, in what is known as the Grito de Jayuya, or the nationalist insurrection of the 30th of October, 1952, a revolution was planned as an answer to the farce of the establishment that very same year of the Estado Libre Asociado, an equally colonial constitution that would allow the US to save face and claim that Puerto Rico was no longer under colonial rule, a status that the UN had declared to be unlawful. The insurrection was crushed by declaring martial law, the bombings of the towns of Jayuya and Utuado, and the establishment of several concentration camps of suspected nationalist militants. Meanwhile, on November the 1st, nationalists attacked the temporal housing of the president, the Blair House. Ultimately, all was designed to bring to the attention of the world the colonial situation of Puerto Rico. While the nationalists were aggressively pursuing their armed resistance, the island's diverse political landscape continued evolving. In 1938, infamous Governor Luis Muñoz Marín founded the Partido Popular Democrático. Initially, it was devoted to the ideal of obtaining independence by electoral means. Soon, in 1944, US intelligence coaxed Muñoz, whom had been allowed to become the Senate president, into abandoning the ideal and declaring that being popular, or a member of the Partido Popular Democrático, and independentista, or a supporter of independence, were incompatible, in favor of a view in which, of a populist view in which Puerto Rico would receive a more favorable economic treatment and greater autonomy. In response to the betrayal of the ideal of independence and social justice by the Partido Popular Democrático, a group of independentistas led by Dr. Gilberto Concepción de Gracia, Albizu's longtime defense lawyer, met in the town of Bayamón on October 20th, 1946, and founded the Partido Independentista Puertorriqueño. The party was founded on the principle of attaining independence of Puerto Rico through nonviolent, social, democratic, and electoral means. The debate as to what was the better course of action to achieve freedom from colonialism has been an open one for generations. The nationalist sector has become disenchanted with electoral participation and eventually became openly hostile to participating in what they call colonial elections, which they are, arguing that these had no chance of effecting change and only legitimized the colonial regime. The socialist sector, represented by the poet Juan Antonio Correger, pushed for electoral boycott. In 1948, the Partido Independentista Puertorriqueño participated for the first time in the electoral process, and it has, as it has in every single election since. In 1952, 15 legislators were elected, and it became the second party in the island. Yet the brutal persecution that it has historically faced has contributed to the loss of the party's franchise on several occasions. Since 1947, with the Ley de Mordaza, or gag law, the PPD, or Partido Popular, and the US government set out a brutal repression campaign against the independence movement in general and the Partido Independentista in particular. Lists of subversives that criminalized all and any political activism in favor of independence were compiled by the government that had a specialized police unit for that purpose. This turned independentistas into pariahs in their own country. An independentista could not get a job. If anyone hired an independentista, that person will get a call from the police and they will say, listen, you're hiring a dangerous person. You should not hire that person. And then the independentista will be fired. So being an independentista in Puerto Rico was to be de facto a criminal, considered a criminal. This turned into independentistas again into pariahs in their own country. The criminalization of the independence movement and the surveillance state that it begat continues in operation to this very day. The Partido Independentista's position concerning the use of force to further the cause of independence was clear on moral grounds. Only nonviolent social democratic and electoral means were acceptable for the party. This was also based on the practical assessment that to engage in armed conflict with a white supremacist military superpower was asymmetrical and thus suicidal. Even when admired and respected, as we all do, the gestural character of the nationalists' attacks was ultimately ineffective and perhaps counterproductive in achieving the objective of getting the people of Puerto Rico to embrace independence electorally. To this day, the Partido Independentista firmly believes that this is a sine qua non element to force Congress to act. That is, having the electoral support of the people of Puerto Rico is a necessary first step in order to force Congress to act, along with international pressure. In 1984, Berríos Martínez returns to the Senate. That's Rubén Berríos Martínez, with almost 250,000 votes. Subsequently, in 1988, Fernando Martín is elected to the Senate in an election with the party offering a new strategy for the solution of the status dilemma. In 1989, discussion of what the possibilities of a solution to the colonial problem could look like began in Congress. It is significant that the party got, It is significant that the party got the Congress to agree to the terms of a possible transition to independence that would not spell the disaster that detractors predicted if Puerto Rico ever became an independent republic. This blueprint makes clear that a transition from colonial status to an independent republic can be achieved with the approval of Congress and on amicable terms. Nevertheless, this process was derailed by the refusal of Congress of seriously entertaining the possibility of granting statehood. A decade later, in 1998, a plebiscite included a version of this independence blueprint. Then comes Vieques. In April 1999, a bomb killed a Vieques resident, David Sanes. This led to the intensification of the somewhat dormant struggle to free the island municipality from the scourge of US Navy presence. Rubén Berríos Martínez began, along with 12 other party members, a civil disobedience campaign by occupying the Allende Beach, since renamed Playa Gilberto Concepción de Gracia, within the Navy restricted grounds. Berríos Martínez had also has also had an instrumental role on getting the Navy out of the island of the municipality of Culebra. Eventually, on the island municipality of Culebra. Eventually, on May the 4th, 2000, the Navy vacated and arrested the protesters. Berrios Martinez was jailed for 3 months, but other militants kept invading the restricted grounds on a steady stream for months. Soon after, Berrios Martinez was named honorary vice president of the Socialist International. He ran for governor and got 100,000 votes. So on a more personal note, I was on the list to invade the grounds, the restricted grounds in Vieques, and I was already slated to board a boat and get into the restricted grounds and probably very likely to get arrested. And to my shame, Bill Clinton agreed to a plan to so the Navy will leave Vieques, and the plans to go into the island municipality of Vieques, well, were dashed because they were no longer needed. So we independentistas probably kind of strangely like to be jailed for a cause. So I was not, and I don't know, I always feel sorry for that. The 2004 election saw Aníbal Acevedo Vilá from the Partido Popular win the governorship. Again, the Partido Independentista loses the franchise, but the first female Independentista legislator is elected, attorney and party vice president María de Lourdes Santiago. In 2005, the PIP sponsored a plebiscite to force the hand of Congress by first deciding if the present status was acceptable, which at the plebiscite it was decided that it was not, and if not, choosing the preferred method between a plebiscite or a constitutional status assembly. Regretfully, Acevedo Vilá sided with a sector of stateholders who got spooked at the very real prospect of setting up a mechanism to end US colonial rule, and vetoed the project that had been approved unanimously by the legislature. Later, this governor was indicted for illegally collecting funds to finance campaign debt. Meanwhile, the island saw the perennial economic crisis deepen. So it was in the year 2006 when the island's economy took a turn for the worse, and it was the beginning of what become the end of our economy. 2008 was the year when the free fall of Puerto Rico's colonial economy reached a point of no return and coincided with the US financial crash. Elected Governor Luis Fortuño from the Partido Nuevo Progresista was a well-connected technocrat, adept at the kleptocratic shenanigans that have come to define this party. One federal prosecutor famously declared, "Corruption in Puerto Rico has a name, Partido Nuevo Progresista." Fortuño added $16 billion to the island's already bloated public debt. 9 billion of those 16 to this day cannot be accounted for. He also set draconian austerity measures that included massive layoffs of 30,000 public employees, a move that permanently crippled public service and made the already poor standard of living on the island much worse. And much is said about how in Puerto Rico the public sector is so huge when compared with the private sector. But the truth is that in islands, in And islands, that's a feature. So islands need a big public sector because of their isolation. So when you're in a mainland and you have connections and you can be easily connected by train or other measures, probably you don't need that much or that a robust public sector. But on an island, it is absolutely necessary to have a robust public sector. In this volatile political environment, emerging parties like Puertorriqueños por Puerto Rico hurt the Partido Independentista's electoral performance by siphoning out progressive votes. This party that did not, the Puertorriqueños por Puerto Rico, that did not adopt a stance towards status, just like the Partido Popular, and was led by a somewhat charismatic technocrat, Rogelio Figueroa, who got a modest but significant percentage of votes. For our party, this unsatisfactory performance was, sorry, I advanced. Sorry. Again, for our party, this unsatisfactory performance in this election was very painful because the candidate for governor was perhaps the best suited candidate to face the particular situation that Puerto Rico faced at that moment. And that was University of Puerto Rico in Mayagüez distinguished economy professor, Dr. Edwin Irizarry Mora. Dr. Irizarry Mora was the person who wrote the textbook that is used around the world to study Puerto Rico's economy. In 2012, Alejandro Garcia Padilla from the Partido Popular, that's why we call it the pendulum elections, because PNP won, Partido Nuevo Progresista won, and then the Partido Popular won. So it went like that, like a pendulum from one of the two traditional parties, from one to the other. In 2012, Alejandro Garcia Padilla was elected governor, again with a plurality, in an election that saw 6 parties vying for votes, 4 of which competed for the votes of the center-left: Movimiento Unión Soberanista, Partido de los Trabajadores, Puertorriqueños por Puerto Rico, and the Partido Independentista Puertorriqueño. Again, the party did not keep the franchise, but Juan Dalmau, a young attorney who was Secretary General of the party, made an excellent performance as candidate for governor. All the while, it became abundantly clear that the colonial model was exhausted. The bankruptcy, generations in the making, the unsustainability of the colonial economic model, and the rampant corruption and graft of both federal and local government could no longer be hidden. Pensions were slashed and draconian austerity measures were adopted on top of the ones already imposed by Fortuño, the previous governor. This debacle forced the incumbent to relinquish, with the Partido Popular attempting to salvage the situation by changing the candidate. In 2016, Ricky Rosselló from the Partido Nuevo Progresista wins the election against David Bernier from the Partido Popular, with once again a plurality. So it's interesting that no longer in Puerto Rico, governors were elected by a majority. Emergent parties, along with independent candidates for governor, make a strong performance. Maria de Lourdes Santiago, again, breaks ground by becoming the first female independentista to run for governor. Independentista Senate and House candidates are elected. Juan Dalmau is elected to the Senate and arises as a charismatic and capable leader. And along with Dennis Marquez, a talented labor attorney in the House, spearheaded the opposition to the culmination of the colonial dictatorship with the imposition of the Financial Oversight and Management Board for Puerto Rico, which we call La Junta, by the name in Spanish, which is Junta de Supervisión Fiscal. Santiago, María de Lourdes Santiago ran a campaign based on the refrain, a la Junta, ni un vaso de agua. For the board, not even a glass of water. At first, the electorate was deceived by the colonialist message that the junta would lock up all the corrupt politicians who had stolen from Puerto Rico. And the anti-junta message did not coalesce electorally, with the candidates who offered an accommodation doing better in the ballots. Eventually, the deeds of this organism became known. Exorbitant expenses paid by Puerto Rico taxpayer money to the tune of hundreds of millions, a clear determination of making handsome profits for vulture investors for whom the members of the junta had already worked previously and would probably work again in the future. An obscene conflict of interest and the lack of respect or empathy toward an island that had suffered the devastating catastrophe of the second most powerful hurricane in its history, when Hurricane Maria devastated Puerto Rico on September the 20th, 2017. September 20th, 2017. This caused public opinion to quickly turn against those who sought an accommodation to Congress's undemocratic imposition of La Junta. Trump's demeaning treatment of Puerto Rico, President Trump's demeaning treatment of Puerto Rico, the refusal to allocate the funds for reconstruction, and when allocated, the refusal to hand them over, along with the deliberate and inhumane undercount of the fatalities of the hurricane, weakened considerably the overblown consideration that public opinion has traditionally had towards the federal government. Finally, the straw that broke the proverbial camel's back came in the summer of 2019. The corrupt anti-Puerto Rican nature of the Partido Nuevo Progresista leadership is laid bare by a social media dump that provided evidence of the cynical hatred and contempt Rosselló and his associates felt toward their own people. It also made clear that this party operated mostly as a cabal to siphon money out of the government to the hands of cronies and associates in a revolving door of well-connected functionaries and lobbyists, both at the local and federal level. At the same time, the infamous media posts make clear the cynical contempt that this group felt towards Puerto Rican nationals, dreaming aloud about a Puerto Rico sin puertorriqueños, Puerto Rico without Puerto Ricans. So it must be known that in Puerto Rico, statehooders, many statehooders don't consider themselves to be Puerto Rican, okay? And they consider that Puerto Rico is not a nation, that Puerto Rico is simply a US territory, and that Puerto Rico has no national identity. And that's only a piece of land owned by the US, and that they consider themselves to be American. So that's why they want a Puerto Rico sin puertorriqueños. It must be remembered that this gentrification is precisely the purpose of the tax haven for millionaires laws 20, 22, and 60, approved 10 years before by Fortunio. This was a watershed moment that set the stage for the electoral results of 2020, won by the Partido Nuevo Progresista with only 33% of the vote. Something unheard of in the history of Puerto Rico, in which the Partido Nuevo Progresista and the Partido Popular used to win by more than 50%. Finally, in 2020, a slew of emergent parties consolidates as a viable alternative to the Partido Nuevo Progresista and the Partido Popular Democrático. Independent candidate Alexandra Lúcaro makes an alliance with the leadership of the Partido de los Trabajadores, and they found the Movimiento Victoria Ciudadana, a neo-Muñozista party that claims to not support a particular status formula. They get 30% of the vote. Proyecto Dignidad, a conservative party, gets 7% of the vote. And Eliezer Molina, an independent candidate, gets 0.7% of the votes. It is interesting and hopeful that the Partido Independentista had an increase of 11.59% of the vote when compared to the previous election. We got 13% of the vote. Today, right now, today, teachers are on strike and already making calls. Pierluisi, renuncia y llévate la Junta. Asking Puerto Rico's governor to quit and take the board with him. So that's a brief rundown of what the history of our fight for independence and against colonialism is. Of course, the history is a little more complicated. I have been in the Partido Independentista since my first vote in 1980. And this is a fight that is extremely difficult. Rubén Berríos always tells us that we are lucky to have survived because we have fought under adverse circumstances for a long time. Any other party will have quit, but we haven't. And the electoral results of the 2020 election gives us hope. Now we need to consolidate on electoral, a good electoral performance in order to be able to continue our fight. And we are hopeful that we're going to achieve Puerto Rico's independence by peaceful means and in due time. There's a lot to be done. We greatly appreciate opportunities like these to get our message out and to get support. I know that the Democratic Socialists of America, we agree. We also are a Democratic Socialist Party. I myself, the Partido Independentista is diverse. There's people who are more to the left in terms of being more orthodox in terms of their view of socialism. There's also people who are more conservative, but the party itself has, for many, many years, held on its platform clearly Democratic Socialist ideology and platform. Yeah, I myself, I believe that wholeheartedly that that's the way to go. And I believe that there's a lot to do, both here in the US and DC area and in Puerto Rico. And I've told our friends in the DSA that you can rely on us. Whatever we need to do to support the cause, we will, because you have been so generous in supporting us, and we need to be have solidarity with the people of the U.S., with workers in the U.S. In this crucial moment in its history. Thank you for listening, and perhaps we might open the floor for discussion.
Oh, well, thank you very much for that presentation. That was really excellent. If anyone has questions, there's a Q&A box at the bottom of your Zoom screen. Just go in there and submit them. I guess I'll abuse my privilege as moderator and start with the first question, which is, what can people living in DC in the United States do to show solidarity with your movement?
Well, we're planning a manifestation on March the 1st to commemorate the attack on Congress by Lolita Lebron and Cancel Miranda, and in that occasion, we are not going to be the lead in that manifestation. It's going to be a number of groups. Frente por Puerto Rico, Boricuas Unidos en la Diaspora. That's going to be in an immediate future one opportunity to express solidarity towards the cause of Puerto Rico's independence. And it will be like statehooders are planning a meeting also, and we would like to have the support. So if we have great support, we want that activity to be visible, to have the most people that we can, so we can make a show of force, of solidarity. The cause of Puerto Rico's independence has always relied on international support and the support of socialists around the world and progressives around the world. Even when Albizu was in the middle of his struggle, many U.S. Congress people supported Albizu, and the people of the United States have traditionally, progressives, supported Puerto Rico's independence, and we are so grateful for that. And of course, we would support progressive causes in the U.S. also, because after all, we are the same. Workers have the same interests everywhere. And given the particular situation that Puerto Rico and the U.S., we are intertwined for good or bad, and we should support each other. And in the immediate future, well, the activity on May the 1st, the secretary of our DC PIP Diaspora DC Committee is and me, we are participating in meetings and we are organizing. So any help that we can get, we will be grateful for. Besides that, opportunities like these, and carrying out the message and clarifying that some people believe that support for statehood is somehow a progressive stance. We would like to educate the American public that it is not such. It is statehood. It's only the culmination of colonialism. It will be a hyper colonial status. So it will be to give permanence to the colonial situation in Puerto Rico, because statehood would not better democratic representation in Puerto Rico. I'm sorry to say this, but the US is not the best example of democratic representation. And having 2 senators and a couple of representatives, that would absolutely not make any difference in Puerto Rico's undemocratic situation. So any help that we can get in getting that message forward, we would appreciate. And also we would appreciate if something is needed from our side. We would love to collaborate with our comrades and be helpful any way we can.
Thank you very much for that answer. So our next question comes from David. He was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about the U.S. Navy's actions at Vieques, the Navy bombing of it, and the actions your party took to halt that.
Yes. The U.S. Army occupied Vieques and Culebra. I think it was in the 1920s. And they began developing a shooting range, and they began and it grew to the point in which the west side of Vieques was occupied by the Navy, and the east side of Vieques was occupied. Vieques was divided in 3 pieces, and the middle piece was where people lived, and the west side was occupied by the Navy, and the east side was occupied by the Navy. Both of them were shooting ranges, but not only shooting ranges, there were laboratories of weaponry. So they tried all kinds of weaponry were tried, and also they simulated war games. They did all kinds of military exercises. And not only that, they rented Vieques to the French, they rented Vieques to the British, and it was a business. It was a business. And they also tried, interestingly, the weapons, the uranium enriched bullets that they used in Iraq. They had been perfecting in Vieques for quite a long time. Vieques was the place where they perfected them. And we knew that many places in Vieques were so heavily contaminated by radioactive substances and so on and so forth. So the Navy, the activities of the Navy were horrible. Besides that, imagine the population living in smack in the middle of those shooting ranges, and the military took hold of the place, and sometimes they ran rampant, as they usually do, and the civilian population were subjected to the pressure of having those experiments done next door. The wildlife, the ecosystem, it was horrible. It was horrible. In Culebra was the first place in which the Partido Independentista, along with Rubén, did the work, and we were able to close the range in Culebra, which had a similar situation. I think it was in the 40s that Culebra was that the Navy abandoned Culebra due to the people of Puerto Rico's pressure. But the situation in Vieques was escalating, and it was getting worse and worse because weapons were becoming more sophisticated. And the U.S. needed a place in which they could test any new armaments, any new ordnance, any new technologies, methods, and where they could also rent to their allies like the French and British and anyone who could pay. It had become a profitable international operation. But the people were suffering, and cancer rate in Vieques was it was off the charts, and it was a dire situation. And it all came to a head when, in a bombing operation, there was a worker because there were towers in which they hired private cops or people to watch. And this guy, David Sanes, was in one of these towers. These towers were supposed to be far away from the shooting ranges, and they were supposed to be safe. In one of the exercises, something went wrong, and the Navy dropped a bomb on the towers that David Sanes was. And that was that. When that happened, it public opinion quickly, which was already tested by the Navy, public opinion turned completely. And the greatest march ever seen in Puerto Rico, more than 1 million people, hit the streets and asked the Navy to leave Vieques. And along with Ruben, who spent a year camping on the Playa Allende, or renamed Playa Gilberto Concepción de Gracia. And then that fight was also a turning point. Vieques, Ruben spent a year there. People who were with him, people from the party, and then everyone, not only the Partido Independentista, everyone in Puerto Rico, celebrities, politicians from all parties, began going to the beach where Ruben was as a sign of solidarity. So that movement coalesced, it gained steam, and ultimately it provoked that Bill Clinton had to relent and agree to take the Navy out. Interestingly, Governor Pedro Rosselló, an avowed statehooder, went to Congress for an audience precisely about Vieques, and he said a famous expression when one of the Congress people tried to convince him to relent from. He was also asking the Navy to get out of Vieques, and Pedro Rosselló said, "Don't push it." And that expression, because it was a statehooder, and we know that whatever the U.S. says, statehooders do. But in this occasion, Puerto Rico as a whole, all parties agreed that the time of the Navy in Vieques was up, and we ultimately succeeded. But as it frequently happens, along with the agreement to stop military operations in Vieques and hand over the land, they promised to clean it up. That part has not happened yet. So the Navy simply forgot, and the unused ordnance, the radioactive materials are still there. And the people of Vieques are still suffering. So it's an open cause, and it's something that also needs to be addressed.
So we have a question in the Q&A box, and I want to remind everyone, if you have a question, you could put it in the Q&A box. And if you can't find that, then put it in the chat, please. But the question we have in the Q&A box right now is it true that a majority of Puerto Ricans support independence? If so, why did the referendum in 2020 say Puerto Ricans support statehood?
No, let me be clear. At this moment, electorally, most Puerto Ricans do not support independence. That's the truth. I have to be honest. We have always surmised that electoral support for independence can go from 10 to 15% at any given moment. We are not a clear majority at this moment, but we must take into consideration this. Independence in Puerto Rico is defined as a state of total anarchy. So if you ask Puerto Ricans, do you support independence? What you're really asking is, do you support total anarchy in Puerto Rico? So when I was a kid, that will be in the 70s. I asked a person older than me, what is independence? And that person told me, independence is, that is, if anyone wants to rape your sister, that person can do it and nothing will happen to him. That's the definition that the person gave me. So the criminalization of independence from the Ley de Mordaza, which is the gag law in the 40s, ingrained in the brains of Puerto Ricans that independence is criminal. So my own mom, when I became an independentista, my mom was a statehooder. When I became an independentista, my mom said, oh, you're going to become one of those terrorists. So you have to consider that when you think about electoral support for the Independence Party, because people have been convinced that independence is something that it's evil. It's something that it's dangerous. Now, with the electoral results of 2020, we believe that people are understanding. Also, we have a new generation of people who are no longer encumbered by the old ways of seeing things. And we have the hope that we can turn that tide. And it's interesting because it's been always my opinion that independence in Puerto Rico needs to make a strong electoral show in order to gain legitimacy. But above the 10%, 15%, let's say a 20%, that would force the US to scrap any plans to give statehood. Because with a 20% of people wanting independence, that will make granting statehood to Puerto Rico a very difficult project to achieve. But we expect that in the near future, we're going to be able to convince statehooders and populares to trust that Puerto Rico can actually become independent. It's interesting because, as I said in the presentation, in the 90s, Congress agreed to a process in which Puerto Rico could become independent, and that independence would be viable. It wouldn't be a disaster, and it could be done in amicable terms with the US, which is extraordinary. And if we can convince people that that can be done, we believe that electoral support for independence in Puerto Rico can be achieved.
So how would you assess the impact of repression by the US government on the Puerto Rican independence movement? I know the FBI was heavily involved in surveilling independence activists. It had some hugely absurd number of dossiers on people. The counterintelligence program that targeted the Black Panther Party and the Communist Party in the US also was aimed at the Puerto Rican independence movement. How would you assess sort of the legacy of that repression to this day?
Let me relate an anecdote about how deeply ingrained is the view in Puerto Rico that independentistas are criminals. I live in Maricao, which is mostly a rural area, and there was a small colmado or grocery shop. And a lot of people sat there drinking beer. And there was this gentleman who, when I got into the shop, he always said, independentista. And in time, I understood what he meant. When I came in, I bought anything that I had to buy and I went out. When I went out, the conversation evolved. How do we get rid of this independentista? Because independentistas were fair game. An example, a historic example, I was listening to a podcast by two young attorneys that it's called Radio Independencia, and they talk about the historical aspects, and they were talking about the carpetas. And there was this one instance in which a lady, her son was an independentista, but she wasn't involved in politics at all. And her son was independentista, and without her knowing, the intelligence division of the police went to the doctor's office where she worked and told the doctor, listen, if you don't want trouble, you have to fire this lady. She's dangerous. Her son is an independentista. And she was in fact fired, and she couldn't get hired anywhere. That was and is the situation. For instance, in Puerto Rico, there are almost no policemen who are independentistas. No one can get into the judiciary being an independentista. No one can get a job at the Department of Education, at the managerial level, at the administration level. So that situation is still in. Some people say, oh, I agree with the independentista view. I love my country. I would like to be an independentista, but I cannot because I cannot pay the hefty price. And that is today. That's happening today. So it's very hard. It's difficult. It has an effect. Now it has gone underground. Of course, we're not going to have the carpetas, which are physical books with information. But of course, we all know how it's done now. Recently, during huelga or strikes, police got access to Facebook posts of independentista, and they compiled the list and they asked Facebook to give them the information, and Facebook gave them the information. Nothing, no crimes committed. Just simply by being at the manifestation or at the strike. So it's an ongoing harassment and persecution, and it's still ongoing, and it's very difficult to do. So being an independentista in Puerto Rico is means to be persecuted, and some people simply cannot handle it, and that's the reality. We've seen no progress in that area, so we hope that in due time we can overcome that, and that's something that we have to fight against every day. And we educate people. We try and we try, but it's very hard to do because still today, you say independentista in Puerto Rico, it's assumed that you're a criminal.
I mean, the FBI in its listing of terrorists still mentions Puerto Rican nationalist as a persistent terrorist movement. That it's shocking to me. I'm gonna do a last call for questions. There's time for more questions, but if you have one, please put them in the Q&A box in the next couple of minutes. Our next question is from Gilberto. Can you talk about the economic argument for independence?
Yes, of course. That's another argument that's used frequently. Many times pretty racist in terms of Puerto Ricans are this kind of basket case. You cannot support yourselves. There's no way, you're too small an island. The people are lazy, that kind of argument. The truth is that we cannot go lower. So if the argument is that somehow the colony keeps us from going broke, so we are broke, we are not productive. So let me address first the negative side. Puerto Rico is drained of its productive resources by US capital and international capital. And in Puerto Rico, companies practically don't pay any taxes at all. And they take all the money out, they put nothing in, they don't pay taxes. So what the US has done is they pay us with credit. They give us a credit card and they tell us, well, we might not let you get the benefit of what you produce, but we're gonna allow you to take credit. So that's like having a worker and pay that worker with a credit card. So where are you gonna find the money to pay for whatever you put on that credit card? So what happened? Puerto Rico's debt. That's why Puerto Rico is so in debt, because money was siphoned out. We didn't get any taxes, any significant amount of taxes. So we had to go broke. And that's the negative side. On the other side, Puerto Rico is a highly productive country. Puerto Rico has an 11% of professionals compared with the 7% of professionals in the US. So our people are highly educated. Our workers are more productive than workers anywhere in the world. And we have potential for tourism. We can support ourselves. We have the wherewithal to be economically viable if we are given the tools of sovereignty. So to give an example, in the 80s, Rubén Berríos met with the Prime Minister of Japan. And the Prime Minister of Japan told Rubén, listen, we can, so Rubén talked to him about how Puerto Rican worker was so productive and we had the best engineers in the world, etc. And the Prime Minister of Japan said, listen, we can set up a plant to build cars in Puerto Rico. Okay. So the State Department intervened and the plant went to Texas. So how can you be economically successful if you cannot control your own economy, if you not get into an agreement with a country to make some kind of agreement to bring industry, to bring investments, because someone else is in charge and someone else will always attend their needs and interests first. So that's what happens. The State Department controls everything in Puerto Rico, and they won't allow us to grow economically. And that's the reality. So Puerto Rico would be a successful republic because we would have control, and we could make business agreements with countries, and we would be free to do so. And it would be on our own terms, and we could make agreements including the US or any other partner, but it would be in in our best interest. But that's not the situation now. That's why Puerto Rico is such a dire economic situation, because someone else is calling the shots.
Thank you very much for that answer. We have a question from Melvin, which is, how would you feel about China helping to fix our electrical grids? By our, I believe he means Puerto Rico's. I'm not 100% sure.
Puerto Rico's electrical grid was devastated by Huracán Maria. It was completely destroyed. It took almost a year to set up again. In my house, we almost completed a year, more than a year, because the hurricane hit in September, and in my house, power was restored on November of 2018. So more than a year it took. So that would be a golden opportunity to set up a sustainable electrical grid. In reality, FEMA should have paid, or FEMA should pay for the rebuilding of the electrical grid. After all, FEMA is a kind of insurance in which we pay taxes for. And they did, FEMA and others, other agencies, they did identify $19 billion to fix Puerto Rico's electrical grid. I believe that all the electrical grid should be set up by solar. If it's China, if it's a provider, it should be anyone who provides a good service and a nice price. But I'm pessimistic. I know what's going to happen. $19 billion, maybe 1, 2, or 3 billion, we're going to see. The rest is going to be gone in corruption and graft. That's what's going to happen, because that's what's always happened in Puerto Rico. I have no reason to believe it will be different. With that amount of money, I believe that we could set up the totality of the system, solar or other sustainable resource, wind, water. We could do that. And if again, it could be the US, it could be China, it could be windmills provided by the French, who are doing excellent windmills, or the Germans, Siemens. It's relevant who provides the services, but it would be an excellent opportunity to set up a sustainable energy grid. And since it's a small island, I think we could do a great job. But then again, we have interests. Again, the lack of sovereignty. We cannot make decisions on our own. Our voices are not heard. We have no democratic accountability of anyone who makes decisions. So that's the main reason why we should be independent. So if the person who makes the decisions, we can vote out of office. At this moment, we cannot do that. So there's no way that we can defend ourselves.
Our final question for the evening, and I want to thank you again for joining us, is there anyone in Congress right now who is supportive, or at the very least helpful, for the cause of Puerto Rican independence?
Yes, that will be a yes. In the case of Alexandra Ocasio-Cortez, she began expressing support for the idea of statehood, but she was educated, because somebody got to her and explained the history of Puerto Rico, the land of her ancestors, and she got the message, and she corrected, and she learned. We also have support from Gutierrez, ex-Congressman Gutierrez. He's no longer in Congress, but he did support the cause of Puerto Rico independence. And there are many people in Congress who support Puerto Rico's self-determination. And self-determination sometimes means that Puerto Rico can choose. But if you look at it closely, some people include statehood or even some form of the colony within like self-determination. But if you study it closely, the only way that Puerto Rico can self-determine is by independence. So internationally, international law provides that a country, in order to choose, has to first have sovereignty. So if we don't have sovereignty, any decision we make is no good because we were not free to choose ab initio. So we have legislators. Bernie Sanders has expressed his support to Puerto Rico's self-determination. We have Nidia Cortez, the Congresswoman, and throughout history, many people have supported in Congress the cause of Puerto Rico's independence or self-determination. And we hope that in the future, when we have the opportunity to present to Congress a viable project, at this moment, there's a project in consideration, and Congress is also hard to. Congress has its hands full, so but we will not relent. We believe that we have to keep pushing. Any help that we can get to present Puerto Rico's case before Congress, it will be greatly appreciated. We're going to keep on yelling, shouting from the rooftops the need of Puerto Rico to self-determine. Our definition of that is independence. And we hope that we can educate Congress people about the need of a free and independent Puerto Rico. We can be friends with the people of the US, and we will always be. And we share values. In this case, for instance, we are democratic socialists. We share the same ideals. What's good for the people of Puerto Rico, what's good for the people of the US. And we have to express solidarity. We are workers all around the world should be in solidarity with each other. And that's a process that we have to keep moving. And besides, any way that we can help the people of the US, because now the US is in a turning point in its history. And I think that democratic socialists have a big role to play. It's sincerely, I believe it's the only way out. So democratic socialism is the only way out. So we need to help our brothers and sisters in the US. And because helping you, we are helping ourselves. And workers, we have to unite. We have to work together. And I hope that in Congress, on the streets, in activities like these, we can further our cause.
Thank you so much, Dr. Rivera López, for joining us tonight. And I think David is going to close us out with announcements. Is that correct, David?
So I will have one announcement, which is to say that if you are interested in being involved in more political education work in our chapter, that you can email us at politicaleducation@mdcdsa.org. We'll have more opportunities to get involved later. And then also, I believe we have Andrew here, who I'm going to attempt to promote to panelist. And he's going to talk other ways you can get involved.
Well, thank you for this wonderful event. So I am Andrew. I'm part of the Metro DC DSA chapter's mobilization team. So what we do in the mobilization team is help people get involved in any way that they would like to, in ways that are engaging, work for their schedule, and generally make it easier to join the chapter. So if you're not sure about what to do in the chapter, if you are thinking of joining, if you have joined but aren't actively involved, I'm going to put a link in the chat, which should show up for everyone. Let's see. mdcdsa.org/chat with a comrade. And if you go to that link, you should be able to sign up for a 30-minute conversation to talk with one of the comrades in the chapter. And, you know, we can tell you about different things that are happening in the chapter, just talk about, you know, just about anything you'd like to. And so we would like to offer that to everyone, and we hope to see you in the future. And thanks again to everyone for setting up this event. It was really incredible.
Thank you, Andrew. And one other thing in terms of political education is that we have a robust reading group program in the chapter right now. So I'm putting the link for that in the chat. If you can learn more and sign up if you're interested. We have a whole bunch of topics that are coming up, and I'm also putting that email in the chat as well. And I'm going to turn it back over to Chip.
Well, I think that's everything, David, right? We're going to close up the session now, or?
Yes, just thanking everybody for everything.
Thank you, everyone who attended, and thank you, Dr. Rivera Lopez, again for coming, and thank you to the Internationalism Working Group for co-sponsoring, and thank you to the DC Puerto Rican Independence Party.
Patrocinarlo, y gracias al Movimiento Independentista de Puerto Rico.
All right, have a good evening, everyone. Bye.
Buenas noches a todos. Adiós.